Hello and welcome to TMI with Aldous Tyler for Friday, November 27th, Black Friday, as it's known. Thank you very much for joining us today. Now, I, as you know, often like to bring in people to interview who I think have ideas you should hear about. No small coincidence that many times they've written books about them, which means not only should you hear about the views, you should probably read them. Now, okay, let me backtrack for a minute. If you've ever stalked me on Facebook, you will know that if you looked at where it says politics for me, it says populist. And that's caused some consternation for my friends because they have this misunderstanding of what that means. To me, populism is the basic recognition that imbalance in how we human beings treat another is the root of just all sorts of societal evils. So imagine my delight to discover that Thomas Frank, frequent contributor to The Guardian and renowned author of insightful political books like What's the Matter with Kansas and Listen Liberal, has a new book out called The People Know, and that's N-O, by the way. And it properly chronicles, in my opinion, populism, its rise in the late 1800s of America, and why the ruling class, even of today, tries so hard to vilify it. Thomas Frank, welcome to TMI.
Aldous, it's great to be here. And thank you for that kind introduction. You put it really well just now that why does the ruling class hate populism? Why did they hate it in the 1890s? Why do they hate it today? And the book tries to answer that. And what's really crazy is it's the same answer for the 1890s and for today.
It's amazing just how many editorial cartoons from the late 1800s I see that express the problems people had with paying rent, with the fact that their labor was being sold pennies on the dollar for value. Things like that are so relevant even today, and those were from 130 years ago.
Yeah, well, look, it's we're living in the 1890s all over again. Aldous, I'm 55 years old, and I feel like I've been saying the exact same things my entire career. My colleagues and I used to do a magazine called The Baffler, and we put out an anthology of our essays in the 90s, and the subtitle of the anthology was something like "The Business of Culture in the New Gilded Age," because we were already saying at the time, it's like, hey, it's an exact repeat of the late 19th century. And the funny thing is that in the late 19th century, they saw that they were traveling down the wrong path, and they corrected. And we're doing no such thing. We're just barreling straight ahead. And it's our situation today. I mean, a lot of my new book is about the 1890s. It's difficult to make statistical comparisons, but if you do it, if you try, and you can do it, they're not exact. We're considerably worse today in terms of inequality, political corruption, stuff like that, than they were then. Monopoly power, oh my God. I think the Silicon Valley guys put John D. Rockefeller to shame.
Oh, well, it's really kind of funny because you go ahead and look at the fact that we had the personification of an 1890s robber baron in the Oval Office for the past 4 years.
Yeah.
But
leading a so-called populist movement. I mean, that's always the word that they apply to him. I know
it really is something. So allow me just to really quickly start breaking down some of the misconceptions, because again, people like myself who identify with the populist movement often get flack from folks who don't understand what it actually is because they hear the media misusing it. So let me start with one. That populism, pardon me, is essentially backwards, or the Make America Great Again movement. And that's actually more of a conservative notion, isn't it?
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I didn't follow that.
I wanted to make sure to note that populism is often portrayed as being retrogressive.
Okay. Yeah, I got it. Yeah. And so that's not what it was. And in my opinion, that's not what it is. So the populism was, I mean, the word actually meant something highly specific once upon a time. here in our country. The word was, by the way, so the way I started this book, I'm from Kansas. You probably know that. And people from Kansas have a generalized sense of what populism was. We don't often know the specifics. We don't know the details, but we have a general sense of what populism actually was. And when the word, just here in the last 6 or 7 years, when the word started becoming a kind of synonym for racist demagogue, and was being used by the media in this sense. Basically all the time. That's how it's used almost exclusively now. Um, uh, it really rubbed me the wrong way. And I imagine it did the same with you. But it's when I would talk to people that I know from Kansas, it would piss them off as well. And so I decided to write this book about populism. And the first question I asked is, where does this word come from? Is it really just a free floating signifier that you can use to mean anything? And what I discovered when you go to look up the history of the word, it actually has a kind of a fascinating romantic history to it. There were people called populists, spelled with an uppercase P. They invented the word and applied it to themselves, and it was a word they were proud of. It was a noble word. I mean, it is a noble word. It comes from the Latin word for the people, populus. And the word was made up one day in May of 1891. We know I was able to find a whole bunch of newspaper stories about it in my research. It was kind of one of the more amusing things that I looked up. The word was made up by a bunch of Kansas politicians riding on a train between Kansas City and Topeka, and they were looking for a nickname for people who supported a brand new political party that they had started the previous, just a few months before that. The formal name of this political party was the People's Party, and it was a kind of farmer labor organization, something you're very familiar with in Wisconsin. And they in this train ride, they hit upon the word populist as a description of the people who supported the party. And the word caught on immediately. It was in the Populist Party newspapers. They had a whole lot of but back then newspapers were identified with political parties. And it caught on immediately, and was, the word sort of went on to, it was a huge hit. Let's put it that way. But it was, well, where should we start? Should I talk about what the populists actually believed? I mean, we might as well. They made up the word, and any definition that you have has to be able to describe the guys who made up the word. Otherwise, the definition needs to be discarded. And so, it's important to understand who they were. And like I said, it was, so it came out of a kind of a farmers union that was called the Farmers Alliance. It was an enormous mass movement. Farmers were a huge part of the population at the time. And in a place like Kansas, they were, overwhelmingly in the majority. And they believed they had a number of causes that are all sort of recognizable left-wing causes. There's no ambiguity about which side they were on. This was a left-wing party. It was similar to the Labour Party in England, which was coming up at the same time. Labour Party in Australia, Social Democrats in Germany. All over the world, you have these left-wing parties springing up to challenge modern industrial capitalism, which in the 1890s is, at the same time is really roaring, and monopolies are forming, and there's all sorts of disasters going on, and interest rates, and anyhow. So populism challenged all this. They wanted to take America off the gold standard. They wanted the government to crack down on monopolies, and they wanted federal farm programs. It was complicated, but that's roughly those were their main three issues. They had a bunch of other things, like they wanted the 8-hour day for workers. They wanted votes for women, things like this. Little interesting side note, they were, of the three main parties at the time, they were the only one of the three that had women in positions of leadership. Nobody else, the Democrats and Republicans, wouldn't go there back then. Anyhow, they were the last successful third party movement in our history. They won a lot of elections. They challenged the other two parties all up and down the ballot. They sent people to Congress, people to the Senate. They had governors, they had mayors. It was a largely regional thing. They were big in the Midwest and the Plains. They were big in the Western states. and they were strong in the South, which was a very agricultural region. Anyhow, they they didn't last long, and I can fill you in on all the details later if you want to know. I mean, it's a romantic story. It's a great story, the story of what happened to populists, but they didn't last long. After they kind of met with disaster in the election of 1896 and fell apart, as left-wing movements often do. After that, fighting with one another, they split into factions, and and that was pretty much the end of them. And uh, I take the word, so my own definition of what populism means as an American tradition, because you can easily extrapolate from the populist movement to then later movements that echoed their language, that picked up on their causes. And there's a populist tradition in American life. And although I don't talk about it in the book, one of the sort of great sort of leaders of that tradition would be Bob La Follette in Wisconsin, the sort of La Follette movement. He was not a populist in the 1890s, but he later sort of came around to a lot of their issues. And this was common. You see this all over the place in America, that their issues then got adopted by a much wider audience, until you had, in the 1930s, you had Franklin Roosevelt in the White House, who was just putting their agenda into place. Basically, we came off the gold standard. They got the federal farm program. He cracked down on monopolies, regulated the banks. Did all these things that the populists wanted. And populism is a kind of cultural phenomenon. There's also a rich history of that in America. Whenever we think about the 1930s, you think of like Frank Capra movies celebrating the common man. The 1930s was a great period for this kind of art and culture. You think of the WPA murals showing, a whole bunch of different working class people from different backgrounds. They loved this kind of thing. But populism celebrated ordinary people, and it specifically celebrated working class people. It was absolutely no, in your face, a party of the working class. This is what they said. This is what they were about. That was the main idea to it. And basically, the Democratic Party sort of took over beginning in the 1890s, but then really in the 1930s took over what the populists stood for. And they've since backed off of that in a kind of spectacular way here in our own time. But that's the populist tradition in American life. It is my shorthand, really brief definition of it is a mass movement of working class people from different races, different ethnic backgrounds, looking for economic democracy. And all parts of that definition are important. You can have a multiracial movement of working class people that's in favor of tax cuts or something like that. That's not populism. It's close, but no cigar. And that's sort of what the Republicans are trying to achieve right now. Or you can have a movement of very wealthy people who want, I don't know, a welfare state or a regulatory state or something. And that's also close, but that's not it either. It's the populist tradition brings those things together. And then, okay, now Aldous, I have to warn you about something. You have to just tell me to stop talking or just break in, because otherwise I will just blab.
All right. Well, then tell you what, let me go ahead and do a quick note. Ladies and gentlemen, as you may have heard originally, we are indeed talking to Thomas Frank, author of The People Know. And it is a book all about populism, the original American tradition, and how it's very much misunderstood nowadays, and for that matter, truly maligned in the mass media as it currently stands. Now, one of the things that I always felt is that when you have a populist point of view, the opposition then would be the elite class, those who
Right.
Generally make their I won't say make their living, but those whose wealth is predicated upon the idea that there are the general populace who make their money for them, that they're just fine letting everybody else toil while they reap the rewards. And the one thing that I've found, no matter what political beliefs a particular elite group may espouse, they often have trouble recognizing that they have multiple kinds of adversaries. For example, in ancient Greece, the term barbarian was coined, or barbaros, because to them, anybody who didn't speak Greek was just saying bar, 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 bar. So basically, they had this problem where they couldn't figure out that all these rich, wonderful cultures that they were just throwing in together were very different. And
Yeah.
similar to that, I feel at least, is that where you have the elites who, well, put it this way, a Democratic elite senator will much more likely recognize a Republican elite senator as someone that they're akin to than,
Yes.
say, a populist Democrat or even a populist Republican person, if that's possible. The point being is that they to them, anybody who doesn't speak the language of Wall Street is just flapping their gums, saying something they just don't even
Bar,
think
bar,
is
bar,
worth
bar,
listening to.
bar. Yeah, I got it. That's good. That's kind of brilliant. That's exactly right. And one of the okay, so one of the strangest sort of stories in the book, it's a story. The book is a history of the populist tradition in American life, but it's also a history of the anti-populist tradition. And this is sort of what I stumbled across as I was doing my research on populism, was the continuity of people who hate the populist tradition in the 1890s, in the 1930s, and now again today. And their political views change, but their hatred for these sort of mass movements of ordinary Americans, and well, just for ordinary Americans in general, that remains it burns, intensely and in exactly the same way as the decades pass. It is absolutely fascinating. I'll give you an example of what I mean. In the 1890s, the original populist movement was met with, as you would expect, right? These are radicals, okay? And they're going up against the sort of capitalist order of the day. And the capitalist order strikes back against them. Of course it does. And strikes back against them in a very, what turns out to be a really interesting way. They call the populists names, but they call them very particular names. It's all about the social hierarchy. And they keep saying, these are people who are at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. How dare they try to challenge us, the people at the top of the social hierarchy, the people who understand how things work. And so you saw it. This is especially in the election year of 1896, the presidential election year. You saw this coming together of the tribes of the elites against what they called populism. And it's kind of complicated. They were actually referring to, by the word populism, they were referring to the Democratic candidate for president, William Jennings Bryan, who had also been endorsed by the Populist Party. It is slightly confusing, but bear with me here. And so they would look at William Jennings Bryan and they would say, this is a demagogue. This is an empty suit. This is a puppet in the hands of these, of a kind of conspiratorial, these shadowy figures behind the scene. They said he's mentally ill. Specifically that he's paranoid. They said he's anti-intellectual because William Jennings Bryan was against the gold standard, and every economist on planet Earth knew that the gold standard was the way to go, and you could not question the gold standard. But most importantly, he represented an uprising of the riffraff. He represented this kind of so this is the 19th century, is a very conservative period. He represented a kind of French Revolution scenario, an uprising of the sort of the jacquerie, the lowest orders of society, people that really have no business participating in politics at all. And that was the objection to him. They called it anarchy. They called it communism. They called it, the French, they called him a Jacobin. He was supposed to be Robespierre, all this kind of crap. And they beat him. Now, what is fascinating to me is that this same criticism of populism is exactly the same criticism that you hear today, with one minor variation. And that is that today they also throw in that populism is supposed to be racist and xenophobic, which would never have occurred to the elites of the 1890s because they themselves were so deeply racist and xenophobic that they would never have accused their opponents of that. That would have been
and society itself was. I mean, nowadays you can have racist and xenophobic elites. Again, I point to a certain Trump, and they can be even wide open about it if they want to. But the fact is that for the general nowadays, people won't, because it's not the way overall society has the flavor of anymore. Society isn't as an absolute a racist, sexist, what's the best way to put it, accepting place. I'm not saying there isn't racism and sexism. Oh no, I'm saying though that society nowadays doesn't find that kind of thing acceptable by and large.
I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this, but
Right.
one of the fun things that I did for this book was doing this anti-populism research. There were a number of political humor magazines in the 1890s. Well, there were 3 of them, all of them published in New York. And they all hated populism, of course. And they would publish these really vicious cartoons attacking populism. And I've assembled a bunch of them on my website. If you go to tcfrank.com, you can look at them. And one of the funny things about these magazines is that when they weren't, the cartoons that I've reproduced are these sort of centerfold cartoons. They're quite large in size. They're full color. They're beautifully drawn. If you turn the page and look at the other cartoons in these alleged humor magazines, they're incredibly racist and viciously xenophobic, and also hated farmers and workers. So, and of course they're anti-Semitic. I mean, in this kind of disgusting way. And you basically start to understand that it's just a hierarchy. And these are, you sort of WASP elite, and they see themselves at the top, and they lump farmers in with, Italians and Germans and Irish immigrants and all these other people and African Americans who are down at the bottom. That's just how they saw the world. And so, of course, they hate populism in the same way that they hate these other groups. It actually makes perfect sense. It's only in our own age that we've reversed that. But otherwise, the attack on populism, it's now kind of an imaginary thing called populism. This attack is exactly the same as in the 1890s. And so I'm asking myself, well, how the hell did that happen? How does this sort of propaganda attack on William Jennings Bryan in 1896 get preserved so that it's still going in our own day? That is a fascinating historical question. And that's one of the questions I try to answer in the book.
Well, very cool. Now, Thomas, I got to say, though, one of the things that definitely strikes me as most relevant is that when you actually look at it, there is a populist movement, if you will, that has kind of reburgeoned lately. And I'm going to point straight to the folks who have pretty much demanded that Bernie Sanders enter the presidential race in 2015. Because remember, he wasn't going to do it necessarily, but he got really pressed by a lot of people who basically together saw that what the elite forces in charge right now have over us is just not sustainable. And so we wanted a champion. And so we pressed hard on Bernie, and bless his heart, he went to do it. And unfortunately, just like in the 1890s, the elite forces were very quick to see that this would be extremely dangerous for the particular way that they make their fortunes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Bernie is I mean, there are examples of the populist tradition that are still surviving, and I would point at him and his movement as one of them. And by the way, if he was on this call, I think he'd probably agree with everything that we're saying. And he understands the importance of social movements too. I think that's one of the really the great things about Bernie Sanders. He knows that it's not just about the leaders, it's also about building a big, a social movement, and that's really important. I hope I doubt he's going to mount another presidential campaign. He's getting up there in years, but I'm sure that there'll be another Bernie that comes along, and this will continue on down the road. What I meant is that I don't think of Donald Trump as a populist.
Oh no.
He uses, or I mean, Steve Bannon actually uses that word to describe him. Bannon throws this word around all the time, and Bannon is an intelligent guy. I think he's up to something with that. But And we can talk about that if you want. But Trump is not really a populist. He kind of does a populist act. He pretends to have the interests of working class people at heart. He talks about it all the time, even. But what he's actually, anybody could see that was a sort of confidence game. And what he was really up to was just finding a new way to get tax cuts for his friends and deregulate polluters and that sort of thing. But that doesn't. I'm getting sidetracked here. I really don't want to talk too much about Donald Trump. I'm glad that he's on his way out, but my God, we are living in interesting times, aren't we?
Oh, we are, Thomas. Now, one of the things I wanted to make a mention of about populism's actual beliefs and benefits versus what everybody thinks that they have. For example, populists are big supporters of public education because they believe that an enlightened populace is the way to go versus having just one or two people who you rely on because you don't know any better. Now, to me, that actually falls into one of the key tenets of science, which is to follow the preponderance of the evidence across studies. Don't just take one person's word for it just because they say they've made a discovery and they published one paper. That's an elitist way of thinking. Instead, you follow the preponderance of the evidence, which is you take a look, you take the temperature of multiple people who have learned and see if that can be reproduced.
Okay, that's a really good point. I've never thought about it that way, but this is one of the biggest sort of slanders on populism is that it's anti-intellectual, that it's hostile to science. And if you study the original populist movement in the 1890s, you very quickly learn that this is not the case at all. The movement thought of itself in some ways as an educational movement. They had these newspapers in every small town in Kansas and all over the Midwest. They would hold these gigantic gatherings of farmers where, you know what a Chautauqua is?
Oh, yes, actually, a Chautauqua.
So you're the first guy in all the interviews I've done for this book. You're the first guy that knows what that is. So they would hold these before Chautauqua. There was the Farmers Alliance, and they would hold these gigantic meetings where they would have experts on various subjects come out and speak to these unlettered farmers, out in a pasture somewhere. And these are people. The rank and file of the Populist Party are people that by and large, did not go to college, probably didn't even go to high school, but were extremely interested in ideas. And I don't mean crackpot ideas. I mean the real deal. They were really curious about modern banking. They're real curious about, the monetary system, all of these things, how economics worked. They were really fascinated by economics. And so it was kind of an educational movement. And, yes, they were not part of the orthodoxies of the age, but and that's true. And you saw this, like when I mentioned the sort of great coming together of the elites in the 1890s, you had these, all of these economists denouncing populism, but the joke's on them at the end of the day, because it turned out the populists were actually right about the big economic issues of the day, the gold standard government, antitrust, this kind of, the populists were the ones who got it right, not the economists. Just kind of a hilarious joke. But once you start tracing this, you can see this again recurring again and again and again in American history, that the movements I'm describing are not hostile to learning, but they are hostile to orthodoxy. They are hostile to the sort of established expertise that, and this sort of builds on the stuff that I wrote about in my last book, Listen Liberal, that what you find in communities of experts is constant wall building to keep outsiders out and to keep themselves sort of safe from any kind of questioning by outsiders, especially in the discipline of economics, for example, where you're not even allowed in the conversation if you're not an economist. And you can't be an economist unless you share like all of these, there are lots of people who studied economics that don't agree with all of these different theories. And so the economics profession says, well, then you're not an economist and you're not invited to any of our reindeer games. And they hold this monopoly on this body of knowledge. And it is a monopoly, and they make mistakes constantly because there's no outside pressure on them to get anything right. It's a club to advance the interests of the insiders, and a lot of professions are. And you see these professions constantly doing favors for getting things wrong. Wrongness is just the beginning of it. You think about the foreign policy community here in Washington, which is this little clique of experts that is like, I mean, how many times do they have to get us involved in a war, for some stupid reason, and get some foreign policy question wrong, but there's no accountability for these people.
No.
Because if you're not part of the club, then you aren't allowed to, you just don't get to be part of the conversation. The conversation goes from them to you, not the other way around. And so
and because they don't want to hear from you, frankly.
Right. Yeah. But it's also, it's just how professions work. This is sociological. This is, sociological thing. And populism tends to be hostile to that, and to demand a very different thing, which is that learning be democratically accessible. And people all through my story talk about this all the time. The idea of all of these populist movements is that learning has to be, everybody has to have a part in it. And so right now, Aldous, we're having this big debate in America about respecting science. You got to listen to the scientists. And that's, hey, I believe in that. I have my COVID mask right here.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm a educated man, and I understand that science gets things right. But the larger debate is, should science listen to us? Because if you just let scientists make policy by themselves, again, you are heading for disaster. I'm going to give you one example, then I'm going to shut up about all this. For 50 years in this country, we have been, more than that, 70 years in this country, we've been debating universal health care. And the public wants universal health care. And it's been the subject of elections since 1948, when Harry Truman ran on it and won on a platform of universal health care. And they stopped him. And who stopped Harry Truman when he went to get that done? It was a group called the American Medical Association. It is the professional association of medical doctors. And you look at who derailed Obamacare. We tried again in 2009, 2010, and this time it's big pharma and the hospital association and the insurance companies. But it's always, when scientists make policy, they make it in their own interests, just like any other group does. They act as a class. And this is something that the populists understood. This is something that I've tried to drive home in my many books. And this is something that, okay, and I know you just started this with a very innocent question about the unity of elites in this country and how elites act together. But yes, they most decidedly do, and they get each other off the hook, and they bail each other out, as we saw in the last Wall Street meltdown 10 years ago. And they refuse to prosecute each other. They prosecute little people, no problems there, right? Fill the prisons with little people.
No issue with that.
Yeah, but to prosecute, some of these guys on Wall Street, oh my God, no, they went to the right schools. These are good people. I knew that guy at Harvard. I wouldn't, come on. He made one mistake.
Right, exactly. Now, Thomas, one of the things that originally I was saying with this is that, you see, what happens though is that the elites are aware that if they push the idea of trusting in experts and not in science, then what happens is that they can easily just pay an expert or two who happen to have the proper scientific elite credentials to say whatever they want. And then they can say, look, our scientific expert says X.
Well, there's a well-known history of that. It's called public relations.
Right. And so the thing I always drive home to people, because I actually have a number of scientific segments I do on my show here at TMI to help just broadly enlighten folks about what's going on in general, is that when we say trust in the science, I'm not talking about trusting in a scientist. I'm not saying listen to Fauci. Sure, he's a reliable source, so to speak. I'm not saying that, though. I'm saying look at what he's saying and then go and check the preponderance of the evidence and see if it backs it up. That's the important part. That's the key, where we then have populism entering, again, democracy, if you will, a democratic feel entering the realm of science, so you can double check facts versus the
and that's very important. Ultimately we do live in a democracy.
Mhm.
And this is so hard. I mean, look at what's going on right now as we're doing this interview. I mean, there's just crazy stuff is going on in this country. Are we a democracy or aren't we? But at the end of the day, of course we are. And part of that means that elites are always going to be, that elites are always going to be, that we're going to be suspicious of elites. This is a country that doesn't, and there's something very populist about Americans. I mean, in my opinion, the populist tradition goes back to Jefferson and Paine. This country despises elites, despises hierarchy, regards hierarchies as unfair. And by the way, I'm a person who agrees with that. And we inherently regard by the way, I'll get another example of what I'm talking about. I was watching a TV show a while ago and the guy was saying, you've got to respect science. It was some, MSNBC or something. You got to respect science. And then in the very next breath, he said, and you got to respect economics. So in other, and this is, by the way, the professional economics is one of these disciplines that, as I mentioned before, has steered us wrong countless. It's one of the most pathological disciplines there is. I've written about this many times in the past.
There are so many alternative views of what economic reality can be that, again, if you actually go out and look at the preponderance of economic studies and evidence, you will find there's many alternative views on how one can handle an economy.
And just wait, even on their own terms, like when they go to make a prediction, it's almost always wrong. I'm talking about the leaders of the profession here.
Right.
I mean, I don't want to belabor this. I don't want to belabor this too much because, but anyhow, there is this sense nowadays that, that hierarchies are. Let's take a step back here. How did populism become a dirty word? It's actually a really fascinating story. Do you want me to go into this?
Please do, sir.
Because I just tend, I mean, I'll just run my mouth for a whole hour.
Although if you don't mind for one moment, Mr. Frank, allow me to remind, we are having a discussion with Thomas Frank. He has a new book out, relatively, I believe, at least in the last month or two, I think, called The People Know, and that's the people, N-O. Check it out anywhere you can find books. Libraries are good, but you know what? I think you wouldn't mind a few sales. In any case, though, the point being is that this book is a rich tome of everything we're discussing right now. And it goes into many different things, including how it is that populism was vilified, which I believe, Mr. Frank, you wanted to get into just now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. While you were talking, I thought of so many different examples of what we've just been discussing. When Franklin Roosevelt was president, and Roosevelt really sort of embodied a kind of a populist sensibility. When he first ran in 1932, the economy was in deep depression. He won in a landslide. And a lot of elites were behind him in 1932. But by 1936, when he ran for re-election, it was clear what he wanted to do. Organized labor was growing all over America. He was regulating the economy. He was regulating Wall Street, for God's sakes. He had broken up the banks. He had taken America off the gold standard. He'd set up all of these work programs, to get people, to get people employed again, get people working again. And the elites of America, again, just like in the 1890s, they came together against Roosevelt in a really spectacular way. I don't want to go into it too much here because I want to get on to the next story, but I tell this whole story and the people know. But one of the groups that sort of enlisted in the anti-Roosevelt crusade was economists. And they signed mass letters and they wrote all these things saying that, Roosevelt famously had a group of advisors that were called the Brain Trust. We all know that what we don't remember about the Brain Trust is that they were regarded as cranks at the time. So all of the leading economists of America would do these, like they would co-sign these public declarations that Roosevelt was being advised by these crazy people who did not meet the standards of professional orthodoxy and this kind of thing. And again, the jokes on the men of science and learning, because they turned out to be completely wrong and Roosevelt turned out to be completely right. This is the basis of the modern state, what Franklin Roosevelt did in the 30s. So anyhow, how did populism become a bad word? And this is a really interesting story. And it happens in the 1950s. So Roosevelt is gone. World War II is over. World War II is this kind of great, democratic crusade in some ways, or at least that's how Americans experience it. There's a lot of solidarity. There's a lot of celebrating of the common man. Do you remember I've been on in this COVID, I've been on a World War II reading jag, and one of the best books that I read about it was Bill Malden's book about it. Do you remember Bill Malden, the cartoonist?
Oh, yes.
So he had these two. So he drew these cartoons for American newspapers about the war, and it was these two soldiers. I'm forgetting their names now. Here you can see this, but one of them was Joe, and the other was, come on, what were their names? Joe and I forget. Anyhow, but it was all about ordinary soldiers. World War II was about ordinary guys. It wasn't about great strategists. It wasn't about the generals. It was about the ordinary soldiers.
Well, it was even about the ordinary women back home who were in the factories with Rosie the Riveter posters.
Exactly. Yep. It was a very populist there was a very populist sensibility about a lot of the way Americans thought about the war. Now, 1950s, all that's in the past, all that's in the rearview mirror. And America is becoming a very different place. Universities are growing by leaps and bounds. The sort of managerial philosophy is on the rise. This is the great age of the man in the gray flannel suit, the organization man. And you have a new generation of intellectuals coming up who fit this ethos. They're called the consensus intellectuals. And their guiding idea is that America has never really had political dissent. America is... I'm quite serious about this. Their idea is that American politicians have always agreed on all the big issues. There's never been any real serious disagreement in this country.
Mommy and Daddy have never fought, children.
Yeah. Well, and when there was serious disagreement, there was something wrong with the people who disagreed. They were pathological in some important way.
That they just wanted to stir up trouble.
Yeah, or they're mentally unbalanced or something like that. And the great historian of this idea, the great historian working in this vein, was a guy called Richard Hofstadter, probably the most famous American historian ever. And in 1955, he wrote a book called The Age of Reform. It was his landmark. It was his great magnum opus. The Age of Reform, and he was going to retell the story of the of the left in America, beginning with populism. And just so you know, up until then, that was 1955. Up until then, American historians were very fond of populism. They wrote very nice things about it. It was regarded as the sort of beginning of our understanding of why industrial capitalism needs to be reformed, why you have to have a strong government, why you have to regulate, et cetera, et cetera. Populism is the beginning of that story. Mm-hmm. Well, Hofstadter comes along and he says, no. Populism is a movement of farmers. It's a movement of people who are not from the city, therefore they don't understand big ideas. It's a movement of people who are on their way down, therefore they suffer from what he called status anxiety. This was a high-flown concept in the 1950s, and he went on down the list. These are people who suffered from mental illness. They were paranoid. These are people who were anti-intellectual. These are people who were xenophobic, and he could prove that because they were people who were from rural states. So ipso facto, they were xenophobic. These are people who were anti-Semitic. These are people who were I'm leaving one out. I forget what it is, but you see what it is. It's basically the same attack on them that was made by the newspapers in the 1890s. Which Hofstadter never acknowledges.
And made again by the newspapers in 2015 and 2016 about the populist upsurge against the corporate Democrat end of things.
That's right. But those people would actually, if you pressed them, and they would say that their criticism comes from Richard Hofstadter.
Interesting.
So they're getting it from him. He never says where he's getting it. He pretends that he just made up this entire critique.
But he's getting it
And
from this. He's getting it from this ethos of
the
not
1890s,
allowing
yeah.
of not allowing history to show that we actually have conflict with sane, rational people, at least.
Exactly. So the idea is that any kind of dissent is dysfunction. This is how we learned it when I was studying history. Dissent is dysfunction.
Wow.
There's something wrong when you have movements like populism. It's not a healthy society. This is not a healthy movement. This is a sign of mental imbalance, basically.
Well, it's a sign of trouble for elites, that's for sure.
Yeah, and anyhow, so Hofstadter's book is massively influential. It's a book of the month club. It gets the Pulitzer Prize, bestseller. It's been described as the most influential work of American history ever published. And he launches, among other things, he launches the word populism on this new incarnation. He says, we're going to redefine populism as a general word for this kind of paranoid sensibility that you see in working class people, in working class movements. And you see it recurring all through American history, paranoid, xenophobic, racist sort of sensibility that you see. That's what populism is. Okay, so this catches on in a huge way. And all the other consensus intellectuals start using the word populism in this way. Daniel Bell uses it. Edward Shills uses it. Seymour Lipset uses it. It becomes how the word is used. Mm. But another funny thing happens at the exact same time. And that is that the American historical profession, other American historians, reject Hofstadter's understanding of populism. And they go back and they do all this research on it. And they're like, no, in fact, they weren't xenophobic. And no, in fact, they weren't anti-Semitic. Some of them were, of course, but anti-Semitism was all over the place in American society. And if by any standard of measurement, these people were less anti-Semitic.
But basically, as a movement, the movement did not embrace any form of anti-Semitism.
No,
right.
Absolutely not. Some of their propaganda would use anti-Semitic caricatures of bankers. There was this idea of it comes from Shakespeare to call bankers Shylocks. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
Oh, yes.
But they would use that. That was a common term then. But in my own reading of their material, they thought that was just a fair stereotype. It's not clear that they meant something cruel to their fellow Americans by saying that.
And again, compared to the literature put out by alternative parties or points of view, I'm certain that they are pretty mild.
Oh yeah, well, oh my God! So one of the things you do not see in populist literature are the kind of cruel racial stereotypes of Jews that you see in the New York magazines that I was just describing that hated populism. So you don't see anything like that. This stuff is so mean-spirited and so vicious. They didn't do anything like that. Absolutely not. And so that's on those grounds, historians in the 50s said, no, Hofstadter, you're wrong. These guys are not, anti-Semitic by the standards of the time. And they, goes down the list. They're not paranoid. They're not irrational. Their attack on the gold standard was buttressed by, they did the research. It's not like they just made it up. And Hofstadter's take on populism was crushingly refuted. And if you study American history and you're in Madison, Wisconsin, there's a lot of people there who study American history.
Oh, yes.
It's kind of notorious as one of the more massively debunked takes on American history. Hofstadter's vision of populism. Okay. So here's the funny thing. It doesn't matter that it's debunked. It doesn't matter that historians completely refute his take on populism. His reimagining of populism catches on anyway. Why? Because there's a whole generation of intellectuals that want to believe that mass movements of working class people are dangerous things. That mass movements of working class people are automatically authoritarian, to use, this is Seymour Lipset's term. Mm-hmm. And, even if those movements aren't, right? Like they're talking about the labor movement here, even if the leaders of those movements aren't particularly authoritarian and aren't racist and are in fact anti-racist, it doesn't matter, because using psychological tests, we can prove that their rank and file is anyway. Using personality. You see where I'm getting? Well, it doesn't matter if they actually aren't racist. We can prove they are.
And in the history that you're talking about, you have this happening coinciding with the Red Scare and where socialism and communism were also trying to be bedeviled, and so they wanted to point back to populism, which has some similar characteristics, and say, look, all of them are evil.
Yeah, so they specifically the boogeyman that they were responding to was McCarthyism. You're in Wisconsin, right. And so Hofstadter and the rest of these guys were absolutely convinced that that Joe McCarthy was an expression of the populist tradition, and this also was massively debunked later on. He, in fact, he was a Republican.
Yes, that would be the word.
And on and on and on. And so that was pretty, but that's what they were reacting to. And they basically decided that populism was a term for proto fascism, and the word caught on. And we've never really looked back. And look, there's a good reason for this. And it's not because populist movements actually are proto fascist. They aren't. The reason that it catches on is because this understanding of populism and of mass movements of working class people as inherently dangerous is really, really attractive to a certain part of society. You see where I'm going with this?
The elite
I can
part.
see you nodding. And that part of society is the same, is that sort of managerial elite that is right then coming up in the 1950s, and that really believes in this kind of consensus school of history, a consensus vision of American life. And so, Hofstadter is quite open about this in his book. The whole idea of it is, the book is called The Age of Reform. The idea of it is, understanding how reform comes about in a society like ours. And he basically says it does not come about through populism. It does not come about through mass movements of working class people in the streets. It does not come about through farmer labor parties. It does not come about through La Follette, people like that. That is not how it happens. The way it happens, because those people are pathological. They lead to McCarthy, they lead to fascism, etc. The way it comes about is when you put people like me and my colleagues in charge. When you put people like us, the leaders of various pressure groups, various, interest groups, when we get together in Washington, not the interest groups themselves, but the leaders of the interest groups, we get together in Washington and we all take our seats around the big conference table and we hammer out an agreement. And that's how you get reform. And so it is strictly a brief for rule by the professional elite.
Right.
All of this literature is, and by the way, they're quite open about this.
Well,
okay, Aldous, I'm shutting up now.
Oh, no problem. One of the things that actually, if you are, let's say, on the more conservative side of things, one of the ill effects of this was how the NRA turned from a sporting and gun club where actually promoted gun safety and things like this into something, because it was just the leadership of the NRA that then was going and making all these deals with these other elites. All of a sudden it became a group that promoted pretty much the opposite of gun safety in so many ways. And your
gun promiscuity,
your NRA, the one that originally was a force for, in my opinion, good in America, because it wanted to see guns handled responsibly, that got twisted and turned by the elitism into something that we now know today is really very monstrous when it comes to respect for anything we call life. Now,
I remember my family. I remember my family's a member of the NRA, and I'm not going to tell you. I don't want to get him in trouble. But he was once explaining. He's very elderly, and I was like, "You're a member of the NRA?" He's like, "Yeah, it's all about gun safety. You gotta learn how to handle one of these things, et cetera, et cetera." I'm like, no, it's not. It's not about that anymore.
If only that's what it still was. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been talking with Thomas Frank. He has a new book out, The People No, you may know him from past books, What's the Matter with Kansas, Listen Liberal. You may even find him occasionally at The Guardian, where he's a notable contributor. And also, if you really want to look him up, tcfrank.com it seems to be his website. Is that correct, sir?
That's right.
All right. And I want to invite you, if this conversation has proved enlightening, interesting, or at the very least gave you things to think about that you hadn't before, I invite you to go find The People Know. Again, that's The People, comma, N-O. Find it at your local library, find it at your local bookstore, but make sure that you understand what populism means and what it meant and what it should mean, I should say. Thomas, in my opinion, again, to me, it's the basic recognition that imbalance in how we treat other human beings and one another is the root of many societal evils. And because of that, and because it's focused on capitalism in our current society, and even back in 1890, that it took those economic roots, but I believe it readily pivots into equal rights for of any fashion, pretty much, whether you're talking race, gender,
Absolutely.
sexuality, because again, the focus is on the fact that we as people should be treated with the same level of respect. And Mr. Frank, Thomas, if you don't mind, thank you so much for writing the book.
Aldous, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for having me on your radio show.
You're absolutely
and by the
welcome.
way, can I just say, I can't wait till this is all over and I can come back to Madison, Wisconsin and drink beer in the Rathskeller again. I love that town.
Plenty of places to do it. We have so many microbreweries, and many of them are very, very good. But in any case, Thomas, I would welcome you back here when that happens. But in the meantime, thank you for joining me virtually on TMI with Aldous Tyler.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Thomas Frank again. The People Know at bookshelves everywhere. Go seek it out. In the meantime, you've been listening to TMI with Aldous Tyler, and we'll be right back.